Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Guardians of Liberty, for bringing me in, and the John Birch Society, and all of you for coming tonight. There's so much to say. We're just going to look at the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg, and I promise we'd be out of here before 8 in the morning, I think is what they told me. So, we'll go as quick as we can. But first, a little story about my grandpa. You guys probably have people like this in your lives. So he was one of those lifelong Republicans. You know, every election comes and he just votes for the Republican because that's what he did. Just check, 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 check. He didn't have to research the issues or the candidates or anything like that. He just voted all Republican. And then 2020 election came around and we found out he voted for Joe Biden. It's like, what? Okay, emergency family meeting. Something weird is going on here. And we didn't have to talk long before we all agreed this never would have happened if Grandpa was still alive. He lived in Chicago, and so no, in all seriousness, they are absolutely trying to steal elections, and we need to stop them. But what I'm going to share with you today, I was asked to talk just about some of the latest stuff coming out of the World Economic Forum, the United Abominations, as I call it. They prefer to be called the United Nations, and what that means for the future of our country. And so I want to start just in the Word of God, and we'll come back to this too before we wrap up today, if I can get this to work. So the Apostle Paul in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11, he talks about Satan deceiving us. And he says, we are not ignorant of his designs. So we don't want to obsess about what evildoers are doing. We don't want to obsess about what Satan is doing. But we want to be at least relatively well-informed on this. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting is that the Bible actually tells us the nature of reality. But we don't hear this much anymore in our churches for some strange reason. Now, 3,000 years ago, David wrote something really interesting in Psalm 2. We're going to start with the first few verses, and then we'll end at the end of the evening with the last few verses. But David wrote, again, 3,000 years ago he said this, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? He said, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." And that's interesting. Some translations actually say the rulers and the kings are conspiring together against the Lord and his anointed one. Now, this was 3,000 years ago. It was prophetic. I suppose David probably had some sense of what was coming. And then there's some really fun news. It turns out in verse 4, God is not scared of these kings and rulers and powers. In fact, he who sits in the heavens laughs. God's like literally laughing at them. So I think we need to laugh a little bit as well. It says the Lord holds them in derision. And then in verse 5 it says he's going to speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. You don't want to be on the wrong side of that, trust me. It says, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So that's coming. It's going to be amazing. And all the schemes of the enemy and the evildoers are going to be not just exposed, but utterly crushed and destroyed. And then Jesus said something really profound in the Gospels. He's quoted twice in the Gospels, in Luke and in Matthew, saying, he that is not with me is against me. So as we go through what we're going to go through tonight, just always keep that verse in the back of your mind. What did Jesus mean? What he meant was, you're either with him or against him. Okay? There's no neutral ground. If you think you're standing on neutral ground, you're almost certainly on the wrong side. Talk to me later because we want to get that sorted out. But this is serious. Right? There is a conflict going on right now. And most people on this planet are totally clueless about it, including, unfortunately, many Christians. And we've got to change that. So in September, I went to UN headquarters in New York City for the Summit of the Future. How many heard of the Summit of the Future? Almost nobody. 160 world leaders were on our soil. Technically international soil, because they were at UN headquarters. They like to pretend like that's its own little island. 160 world leaders. Joe Biden was there, presidents, kings, prime ministers, dictators, and they had a very serious mission. In fact, the Secretary General of the United Nations, his name is Antonio Guterres, used to be the leader of the Socialist International, by the way, the biggest socialist alliance in the world. They have member parties from all over the planet. They govern about half of the nations of the world, lots of communist parties as well, literally blood of millions of people on their hands. And Antonio Guterres had a quote, and they really liked the quote. They put it up in huge letters, all these posters, and it said, you can't build a future for our children, for our grandchildren, with a system built for our grandparents. And so their mission at this Summit of the Future was to reform the United Nations. They were going from UN to, as they put it, UN 2.0, okay, the new and improved United Nations. Now, I don't imagine most of you were paying much attention back in the late 40s when they originally created the United Abominations. But they sold this to the American people, and if you were in school, you probably remember that it's just about peace, right? We were just coming out of World War II, and nobody wanted more war. So this is just an organization to bring peace. Well, the UN 2.0, as they explained, is not just about peace anymore. Now they're going to deal with education and the economy and the environment and emergencies and the internet and artificial intelligence and future generations, and you name it, they want to control it. And they were very, very open about this. One of their big power plays was this emergency power. And right before the meeting, the Secretary General put out a policy brief, and I wrote an article about it for the Epic Times. It was unbelievable. He was saying, and you can read this for yourself, it's still on their website, it's only about 27 pages, said if there's a global emergency, by the way, he will decide when there's a global emergency, and he will decide what constitutes a global emergency, then all nations, all governments, all businesses, all sectors of society must bow down to him. Said everyone must obey what they called multilateral agencies, just UN agencies. So they have, their World Health Organization is the equivalent of the Department of Health and Human Services. The UN Environment Program is the equivalent of the US EPA. So for every agency that we have, they have one at the global level. And if there's a global emergency, and they listed some examples, environmental emergency, a conflict, an economic emergency, something from outer space, something that we can't predict. Doesn't even have to be an international emergency. It might just be a regional one. Then everybody's got to bow down to the UN. And of course, they enshrined that in the final document. They also said that all nations must submit to the rule of what they call the International Court of Justice. It's like the wannabe World Supreme Court. You should read this thing. It's about 60 pages long. Every government in the world, including yours, or at least allegedly yours, agreed that this was the way forward for humanity. And so I caught up with the spokesman for the United Nations. His name is Stefan Jurek, and asked him about this. We'll let you guys listen to this little exchange. Say, oh, this is not about world government. Okay, it's not about world government.
With New American Media. Yeah. To the extent that the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future have been mentioned by policymakers at all in the United States, it's been very negative. We had a congressional delegation last week, had a press conference say this was an attack on our sovereignty. And last week we had 26 U.S. governors issue a statement saying that they weren't going to comply with UN dictates and mandates. Is the Secretary General concerned about public opposition, especially among Republicans in the United States?
Look, this is not, the Pact for the Future is not about world government. It's about making an organization of independent, sovereign member states work better.
Okay, it's not about world government, but we really need world government.
Body where governments come together, sovereign governments come together to try to solve problems that impacts them all, that try to deal with problems that have no borders, right? Not one country can deal with the rising seas. Not one country can deal with global pandemics. Not one country can deal with international terrorism.
Oh, so it's not about world government, but one country can't deal with these things. We all have to do it. Rising seas, the global warming hoax. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. I've been following the UN global warming clown circus around the world for 15 years now. It's all a lie, as I suspect most of you know, but we'll look at why they're doing it and how they're doing it. Also, terrorism. Oh, the UN's going to be in charge of terrorism? Interesting. As the Secretary General puts it much more simply, is a global problem. So if global problems require global solutions and everything is a global problem, you can imagine where this leads. And frankly, they've been coming out of the closet on this for quite a while. I wasn't even in elementary school yet when the President of the United States went on television and announced to the world a new world order. Did you guys remember that?
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
All right, there's a lot to unpack there, right? But credible United Nations, I mean, that's an oxymoron right there. But he said we need a world where the rule of law is going to govern the conduct of nations. Okay, they've started calling the UN General Assembly the Parliament of Humanity. A parliament, I looked up the definition, it's a sovereign legislative body. Every government gets one vote in the UN General Assembly. That means the United States of America gets one vote. So does Zimbabwe. Okay. So does the little fat guy in North Korea. Wow, what will that lead to? Now, he also said we're going to use the UN's peacekeeping role, which, if you know what that means in UN speak, they're talking about the UN's military forces. They wear the blue helmets, and they run around, famous around the world for raping women and children, slaughtering civilians, bringing peace at the barrel of a machine gun. We're going to use the UN's peacekeeping role to bring about the vision of the UN's founders, is what he said. Okay. We know a little bit about our founding fathers, I hope, in this country. They believe that God gave us rights, that we create governments to protect those rights. They got those ideas from the Bible. God said, thou shalt not murder. That means you have a right to life. God said government must punish evil. Murder is evil. Therefore, government must help you protect your right to life. God said, thou shalt not steal. Therefore, you have a right to property. So these are basic ideas. We know what our founders in this country believe. What did the founders of the United Nations believe? Well, I'm glad you asked. Here's some of them. Now, of course, FDR, big-time, big government guy, surrounded by actual Soviet agents like Harry Dexter White and many others. He had passed away, but he started kind of the nucleus of the UN during World War II. But then they created the official organization at that conference in San Francisco. And we sent a guy, you might recognize him up here, Alger Hiss. Anybody familiar with Alger Hiss? Very few. And there's a reason why, very few. This guy was the hot stuff at the conference. In fact, they liked him so much, they made him the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. Then they made him the first Secretary General of the United Nations, and then we threw him in prison. We threw him in prison because he was a spy for Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass-murdering savages to ever walk on this planet. Slaughtered tens of millions of people, single-handedly, including the vast majority of his own lieutenants and deputies. The Soviets also sent their guy, see him right there, Mr. Molotov, foreign minister of the Soviet Union. So there's some of the founders of the United Abominations. And I don't want anybody to get the impression that this is just a Republican problem, right? The Democrats, the Uni Party, love this idea too.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order. The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
All right, so we need a new world order. And we can watch New World Order videos all week. I mean, almost every world leader you can think of is on record publicly pledging allegiance to the New World Order. This is not a new agenda. If you go back to the very beginning, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, one of the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations, we'll meet him later. He wrote a book. It was published in 1950 called War or Peace, and he let the cat out of the bag. He said in the book that the United Nations represents not a final stage in the development of world order, but only a primitive stage. He said its primary task is to create the conditions that will make possible a more highly developed organization. And then he just totally spilled the beans. You can get this book at your local library. He said, I've never seen a proposal made for collective security with teeth in it, or for world federation, or for world government that could not be carried out either under the United Nations or under the UN Charter. From the very beginning, the agenda was to turn this thing into a one-world system. Now, all those guys that met in San Francisco, we were just talking about, under the leadership of Alger Hiss, he took them down to a very interesting meeting. Again, show of hands, how many are familiar with the Bohemian Grove? Wow, this is a very well-informed audience. So congratulations to you guys. It's a group of weirdos, hundreds of them, meet in the redwood forests of Northern California, and they do strange rituals there. And there's a really interesting PhD paper about how all the founding delegates of the UN went with Alger Hiss down to the Bohemian Grove. Now, I don't know if you guys can see from where you're at, but this is a picture of one of their big areas at their compound. It's a 40-foot stone owl with some moss growing on it. And you can read this PhD paper. It was written by a doctoral student at the University of California. It's very interesting about how Alger Hiss led them all down to this secretive meeting. And I just so happen to know a guy who snuck in to the Bohemian Grove with a video camera and filmed it. Okay. And they're standing in front of this 40-foot stone owl. I'm going to show you a little excerpt. It's about a 20-minute video. We're just going to watch a little bit of it. And they're burning what they claim is an effigy of a child at the foot of this 40-foot stone owl, singing about forest spirits. They call the ritual the cremation of care. There's a little bit of this video.
I'm a relative, but so is here, as
So okay, you can watch that whole video online. It's really weird. Richard Nixon, you might remember him. So he went to this meeting, and he wrote in his autobiography that the most important speech he gave in his entire political career was the one he gave at the Bohemian Grove. He said, it gave me an opportunity to reach the men of influence in this country in privacy. And then, I don't know if you ever heard those tapes that got leaked out of the White House that he had recorded. He did not think very highly of this group. He called it the most blankety-blank homosexual thing he had ever been to in his life. But in his autobiography, he did the smart thing and praised it. But the guy who took that video, this well-known radio host, snuck in there with a video camera, and he confronted one of the guys that he saw there. You might recognize him, David Gergen. He's been a top advisor to at least 4 American presidents. And this guy caught up with him on the streets of Washington, D.C. and asked him some questions.
Rove of 4 presidential administrations. Okay, one last question. I read a Washington Times article many years ago where you had a comment about the organization, and then now it's been in the Wall Street Journal, it's been in a lot of different newspapers, and that's the Bohemian Grove. And back in, what was it, 1996, when you joined as a Clinton advisor, the Republicans were criticizing you, oh, what about Bohemian Grove? And then you countered them by saying, hey, I don't run around in the woods naked. What did that mean? Here is the before-mentioned Washington Times article where he said, I didn't run around naked like they do.
I don't know what quote you're referring to. I'm not aware of any quote like that. Listen, I am a happy member of the Bohemian Grove. I like the folks who come there, and it's really inappropriate for me to talk about the group beyond that. Thank you.
Have you been there for the ceremony with the cremation of care?
Frankly, I don't think that's something I need to talk to you about.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to talk about it either. That's kind of awkward, isn't it? But so this is weird, right? You got presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, cabinet secretaries, both parties, by the way. This is not a Republican or Democrat thing. It's a big club, and you're not in it, okay? Hopefully. But what did Jesus say, right? You're either with me or against me. What do we suppose about people who are burning effigies of children at the feet of 40-foot stone owls? Does that sound like people who are with him or against him? And there's many of these other groups. We're not going to have time to go through all of them. In fact, we're just going to look at just a very small handful. Another one's called the Order of Skull and Bones. Anybody heard of the Order of Skull and Bones? Man, you guys are awesome. This is so great. So there was a great historian at Stanford University. His name was Anthony Sutton. He passed away now. But he had not thought much about Skull and Bones, but this wonderful lady that I got to know very well in her final years, her name was Charlotte Iserby. She was a senior advisor on education to Ronald Reagan, and her dad had been a member, and her grandpa had been a member, and she didn't know much about it either. I got to see the fancy clock that they gave her dad, all the members. They get 15 new members every year. And when her dad passed away, she inherited all these papers, contact lists and documents from this weirdo group. She said, Anthony needs these. So she got them to Anthony Sutton. He said, wow, this is big. So he wrote a book. He wrote lots of good books. I don't think you can properly understand our country without understanding the work of Anthony Sutton. But it's called America's Secret Establishment, an introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. And in this book, he describes the Skull and Bones as a recruiting ground for a global conspiracy for world government. Okay? Now, obviously, I don't endorse ABC fake news, don't get me wrong, but they did a good segment in 2001 on this weirdo little group at Yale, and I want you to listen.
And so when we heard that some enterprising characters had managed to spy on the famous Skull and Bones Society, well, we couldn't resist. Here's ABC's Dan Harris.
The videotape provides a grainy glimpse into what appear to be the initiation rituals of a secret society that's been around since 1832, whose members have gone on to be leaders of Wall Street and the White House, the Senate and the Supreme Court.
They're sort of trying to scare the initiates, make them disorient them, frighten them.
New York Observer investigative reporter Ron Rosenbaum accompanied a team of Yale students who shot these pictures 9 days ago. Rosenbaum's curiosity about Skull and Bones was permanently piqued when, as a classmate of George W. Bush, he lived right next to the Tomb, the group's heavily fortified home. From their perch, Rosenbaum and his cohorts taped the Tomb's courtyard. What they captured, they say, was initiates, known as neophytes, being forced to kiss a skull, then members performing a mock killing. It may look...
Yeah, I'm sure that's the kind of stuff you guys do on weekends also, right? Kiss skulls, mock sacrifices, laying in coffins, doing weird sex acts. It's kind of weird. So they have a strategy that they use, and Anthony Sutton describes it in his book. He says they use this dialectical process to bring about change, and they said this process requires conflict, and conflict requires a clash of opposites. You can't just have a right, you have to have a right and a left. You got to control both sides of the debate. And so there are lots of examples we could look at, but here's an interesting one.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go
I'm sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web.
Number 322?
First of all, he's not the nominee. And, look, I look for...
Are you prepared to lose?
No, I'm not going to lose.
You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us? Not much, because it's a secret.
Yes, always the weird laugh when they get called out on that. It's weird. What are the odds that out of a society that recruits 15 new members each year, both major party presidential candidates come from the same group of weirdos? Now, this is an organization that's been at the forefront of the effort to globalize humanity. And there are many others. They all hate Donald Trump, as I will share with you. But I want to look at one more. This is actually not a secret one. They have a website. You can find their membership list online. It's called the Council on Foreign Relations. It was actually created in 1921 after the U.S. Senate very vigorously rejected involvement in the League of Nations. Right? We had had World War I. They said we need a world system now to make sure we don't have another war. The U.S. Senate said, thanks, but no thanks. We're not going to be doing that. And so they said, we need to get America sucked into this thing or it will never work. So they created the Council on Foreign Relations. And we had an admiral who joined. He spent 16 years as a member. His name was Admiral Chester Ward. And then he defected, and he blew the whistle. He wrote a book on what they were up to. It's called Kissinger on the Couch with the great Phyllis Schlafly from St. Louis. And he said in this book that the main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is promoting the disarmament of U.S. sovereignty and our submergence into an all-powerful one-world government. He said this lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. And he said in the entire CFR lexicon, their vocabulary, there's no term of revulsion carrying a meaning so deep as America first. Interesting. Now, they actually brag about what they're doing in their little magazine. Ward said that if you want to know the policy of the U.S. government a couple years in advance, just subscribe to their magazine. It's called Foreign Affairs. And they brag what they're doing. Here in 1974, one of their writers, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, said, yeah, the old-fashioned frontal assault for world government's not going to work. We've got to erode national sovereignty piece by piece to build this house of world order. And they remain very influential. You might recognize this lady, the Wicked Witch of the West. I mean, Hillary Clinton, sorry, former Secretary of State. So she was giving a speech at their Washington, D.C. headquarters. Listen to what she says to him.
Very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have this far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future. I mean,
We thought the American people told her what she should be doing, or at least the president, Barack Obama, that we elected, but no. According to Hillary Clinton, the Council on Foreign Relations tells her what she should be doing and how she should think about the future. Okay. And by the way, again, this is not a partisan thing. Darth Vader.
It's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
There's that laugh again, right? Never mention it to the suckers back home. They might not vote for me. Right? And then Joe Biden. Right? I think a lot of us have wondered, like, who's telling this guy what to do? So, like, it's not Congress, obviously. It's not the American people. Who is his handler? Satan? No. Well, here he is sitting next to Richard Haass, who at the time was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Listen to this interesting little exchange.
The subject, though, today is another article in the magazine. I probably should introduce myself to people, everybody. My name is Richard Haass, by the way. I work here at the Council on Foreign Relations.
And I work for Richard.
And I work for Richard. Oh, and here we thought you worked for us, right? No. So again, there are about 5,000 members of this group. I actually printed the membership list in the back of my book, Deep State, the Invisible Government Behind the Scenes, just so, you know, when someone's running for Congress, you could just real quick check, oh, member? Okay, you're not it, right? So lots and lots of these guys. And Newt Gingrich, you might recognize him. I don't know him. I like that he shares my stuff on the internet every once in a while, but I don't necessarily endorse him. But he said something really interesting on Fox about Donald Trump. Listen.
And now they're faced with a very real prospect of Donald Trump becoming the leader of the party, and it absolutely drives them crazy. They just cannot imagine sharing. Well, because he's an outsider. He's not them. He's not part of the club. He's uncontrollable. He hasn't been through the initiation rites. He didn't belong to the secret society.
Wow, isn't that interesting? So there's a whole bunch of these groups that are promoting one world government, some of them secret, some of them not so secret. You got the Bilderberg, you got the Trilateral Commission, you got a few more that will look at the World Economic Forum. Lots and lots of these groups. At this point, I mean, practically running through the streets naked promoting one world government. But let's go back to what Jesus said, either with or against, right? Whose idea was it to divide mankind into nations? Was that a human innovation? It turns out it was not. If you go to your Bible, Acts chapter 17, the Bible says God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. There goes racism, right? He made us all from one man. And then it says, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. God even determined how long nations would exist and the boundaries of their dwelling place. It was God's idea to separate mankind into nations. And I don't know exactly why he chose to do that, but he did. It's repeated in Deuteronomy 32, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. That's Deuteronomy chapter 32. It was God's idea to divide man into nations. It was also God's idea to institute marriage and family and private property. And you notice these evildoers are waging war on each and every one of those institutions, principles, and moral codes. So the history of how God divided mankind into nations, you can actually read it in Genesis chapter 11. You might remember the story. God said, hey, spread out across the face of the whole earth. And they said, no, we're good. We're just going to hang out right here, build a big tower. And then God kind of forced the issue, confused their languages, and they had to scatter. Anyway, it's a fascinating story. But anyways, the point is, it was God's idea to divide mankind into nations. So we should not be surprised to see evildoers trying to undermine this institution that God created. And we'll come back to that subject. But you might be asking, what is this New World Order going to look like? Is it going to be like a pro-America, pro-freedom New World Order? I see some of you shaking your heads. Absolutely, positively not, right? And I can't think of anybody better to give us some insight into what the New World Order should look like than George Soros, the guy who has put more money into our political process than just about any other person in the entire history of our country. He's poured billions of dollars into manipulating our politics. So here he is doing an interview with the Financial Times. It's a globalist mouthpiece newspaper. And listen to what he says. It's very interesting.
So I think you need a new world order that China has to be part of the process of creating it. And they have to buy in. They have to own it the same way as, let's say, the United States owns the Washington Consensus, the current order.
Okay, so the most murderous dictatorship in the entire history of mankind needs to own the New World Order like the United States owned the previous order. How many people think that's a good idea? No takers, huh? Okay. By the way, if you know anything about communist China, you know it is absolutely ruthless. The ruthless persecution of Christians, dissidents, anybody who disagrees with their craziness. The most sophisticated tyranny ever imagined in the history of humanity. And of course, Soros is not an outlier here, by the way. I have a whole 2-hour presentation I do showing that the globalists built up communist China. They're using it as an engine to move us in that direction. They're also using it as the model for the global system they're trying to build. And here's Klaus Schwab. He's the founder and non-executive head of the World Economic Forum.
I respect China's achievements, which are tremendous over the last over 40 years since the opening up and policy and reform policy came into action. I think it's a role model for many countries.
Yes, China is a role model for many countries, okay? Because that way, if you speak out, we'll just kill you or put you in a re-education camp, okay? But then something happened. Donald Trump won re-election. They were really depressed. Okay? I was actually supposed to be there this year, but the Indian government did not grant my visa, and so I was not able to stop in Switzerland on my way home. They finally did grant it. I'll be going over there in April. But anyways, I wasn't able to go this year, but I did watch some of it on the live stream, and I hate to say I enjoyed watching the tears, but a little bit of schadenfreude. But here is Walter Mead, columnist for a bunch of fake news outlets, talking about how terrible it is that Donald Trump won and we lost.
And they had to we need to also factor in not only who's won, which is Trump, but who's lost, which is to say us.
Yes, yes, at least temporarily, right? We have a 4-year reprieve here. And Trump's been really vocal on this. Here he is.
Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo.
Oh, it's like nails on a chalkboard for the globalists, right? No, our precious dream. And then he went even a step further, and he starts touting Jesus Christ. Oh, goodness.
I believe in God. I believe in the Bible. I'm a Christian. I have a lot of reasons. I love people. And our country needs a savior right now, and our country has a savior. And that's not me. That's somebody much higher up than me. Much higher up.
And there's a lot of comments like that. You know, people ask me, do you think Trump is a Christian? I don't know. It's not my place to judge the man's heart. That's between him and his God. But he has been very, very open about proclaiming the name of Jesus. I don't know if you guys heard that wonderful prayer that they used to start off the first cabinet meeting of the second administration. It was beautiful. I don't know so much about Paula White. That's a subject for another day. But it's impressive to hear this now coming out of the White House after what we saw over the last 4 years. Now, of course, a reminder from the Bible, right? Put not your trust in princes and the Son of Man in whom there is no salvation. We must have our trust in God, not politics or a political leader. But man, he's really taken a sledgehammer to this one world order thing. I mean, he's withdrawn from so many UN agencies. Probably most of you have never even heard of all these UN agencies, including some really, really important ones. He is ripping this thing to shreds. They're very scared. This is undercover video of one of their lawyers talking about, I don't think the UN can survive another Trump term. And here's, you guys know Chuck Schumer, Senate, used to be majority leader at this time. He's on a TV show with this weird guy, Rachel Maddow on MSLSD. And listen to what, so Trump had been criticizing the intelligence agencies, and Chucky Schumer thought he'd give a nice warning there.
Let me tell you, you take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. So even for a practical, supposedly hard-nosed businessman, he's being really dumb to do this.
Oh, and here we thought the guy we elected to be president was supposed to oversee the intelligence. No, you got it wrong. Right? Everybody in Washington, apparently even our Congress creators, knows you take on the intelligence community, they got 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. So what does that look like? Here's a panel discussion, a bunch of former heads of the cocaine intelligence agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. And really interesting comments. The panel moderator asked about the deep state trying to take out Donald Trump. Let's see what they say.
Concern and often used term about a deep state being there to take him out.
Thank God for the deep state.
Oh, thank God for the deep state trying to take out the man the American people elected to be their president. And he's just like, he says it on TV. And he wasn't arrested afterward. True story. So what are some of these 6 ways from Sunday? Well, let's meet, that was former CIA Chief John McLaughlin. Let's meet another former CIA Chief, General Michael Hayden. He's going to brag about some of those 6 ways.
First of all, David's description of what you can do with metadata, and quoting a mutual friend, Stuart Baker, is absolutely correct. Okay? We kill people based on metadata.
We kill people based on metadata. No. As far as I'm concerned, that's a smoking gun. Right? That's like literally a confession. He should have been hauled out of there in handcuffs. What do you mean you kill people based on metadata? This is still America last time I checked. We still have a presumption of innocence. We still have a right to a trial by jury with the right to bring in witnesses in our defense. But no, they have now decided that they get to kill people based on their metadata. Better make sure your metadata doesn't look suspicious, okay? So let's go back to the United Nations for a minute. They have the 2030 Agenda. They also call it the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And they actually call this the Master Plan for Humanity. Those were the words used by the President of the UN General Assembly when this thing was ratified in 2015. The Communist Chinese Party, right after it was adopted, used every propaganda organ at their disposal to brag that they played a crucial role in creating the 2030 Agenda. And if you read the 2030 Agenda, that would not surprise you at all, right? You go to goal number 10. God said, thou shalt not steal, but the UN and friends has decided that we need to reduce inequality within and among countries. Or said another way, we need to take your stuff, middle-class America, to redistribute to our third-world kleptocratic friends who are doing us a favor by keeping their people in poverty and tyranny. And by the way, they get very specific here. They said this is only possible if the wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. Okay. If that sounds like Fidel Castro or Robert Mugabe or Joseph Stalin or Vladimir Lenin or Pol Pot or any of the other mass murdering monsters who've slaughtered well over 100 million people, of their own people, just in the last 100 years. That's because that's exactly what they said. And yet now our government and every other government in the world has agreed that that's where we need to go. They also said in the 2030 agenda, we're committing to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services. If that sounds like the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, good, because that's where this comes from, right? How are they going to change the way we produce and consume goods and services? Well, they're going to control the way we produce goods and services. The people, right, as Marx said. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this because I believe the most important element of their strategy is brainwashing your kids. And they actually say that. If you go to the 2030 agenda, goal number 4 is about brainwashing your kids. By 2030, it says all learners, notice there's no exemption for homeschoolers in Missouri, all learners will have the ability not just to submit to this crazy ideology from hell called sustainable development, they're actually going to promote it. Okay? And as you read on in this goal 4, they need to know global citizenship is one of their big, important points. They need to know what they call gender equality, which is radical feminism, destroy the family. They need to know human rights, which if you know UN speak, human rights are the opposite of what we understand in our country with God-given rights. Right? Under human rights, the government gives you some privileges and they can take them away at any time. If you don't believe me, read the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 29. None of these rights and privileges may be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. It'd be like having the First Amendment say, Congress shall make no law bridging the freedom of speech unless you say something Congress doesn't like, in which case, yeah, we're going to throw you in jail. So one of the tools they're using, and education is my passion, by the way. I've got some resources in the back. I do believe this is the most important battle, because even if we do really good on politics and all the other stuff, we're not going to be able to hold back the evildoers indefinitely if they succeed in brainwashing 80 to 90% of our kids, which is where they're at right now. But they have a new tool. They call it social emotional learning. How many have heard of social emotional learning? Excellent. Very good. So when I first heard about this, I did a deep dive investigation. I believe it was the first critical investigation into social emotional learning. And I went to their website, CASEL. It's the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, funded by Bill Gates. It is the world's premier organization for promoting social emotional learning. And they said it's meant to create global citizens. And I went to the History tab, pulled it up, and you probably can't see because it's too small here, and it's still not behind me. But they said CASEL and the term social-emotional learning came from a meeting in 1994 hosted at the Fetzer Institute. And I had never heard of the Fetzer Institute, so I had to look that up. Turns out the Fetzer Institute is a center of New Age occultism founded by a disciple of Alice Bailey, the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. Their whole purpose is to build what they say is the spiritual foundation for a loving world, and they're working toward a transformative sacred story for humanity in the 21st century. So I did a little more research on John Fetzer, huge fan of all things Lucifer, true story, okay? And then I did some research into the lady who's leading the charge for social emotional learning. Her name is Linda Lantier. She's a professor of education at Columbia University's Teachers College, the most important teachers college in the world. Okay, that's where John Dewey set up shop, if you know John Dewey, the founding father of America's so-called public school system. But I want you to listen to Linda Lantier, because she's going to tell you where she's getting her ideas from, and I think you're going to be a little bit surprised.
I'd like to offer some guiding agreements that hopefully we can all agree to in this next hour and a half that we're spending, and they come from one of my teachers who, by the way, showed up at my council table, always does. I hate to say she's passed to another dimension because I have regular communication with her.
She's getting her ideas from her dead friend, and I hate to say she's dead because I'm still talking to her. She comes to my council table every night. I like to say she went to another dimension. What? Okay, if you read your Bible, you'll find out very quickly it's not your dead friend, okay? The Bible calls this necromancy and says it's an abomination. And by the way, it's almost certain you're talking to a demon, not to a dead friend. So here's Linda Lantier again. This is a video from the Fetzer Institute promoting this madness. Check it out.
Courses like this are rooted in social and emotional learning, or SEL for short, a style of teaching that was pioneered by Linda Lantier,
I did not imagine that I would be living to see some SEL in 92% of the nation's schools.
It's a lot higher than 92% now. It's even infiltrating our Christian schools now. They sprinkle a few Bible verses on it and say it's Christian SEL. So this is really amazing. The NEA actually says this is more important than the traditional academic subjects like reading, writing, and math. And that may not be surprising to you. According to the federal government's own data, less than 1/3 of your children are even proficient in reading, writing, math, science, or history. I wish I was kidding, but I'm not. But SEL, according to the NEA, is more important now than any of that other stuff. Okay? And they use a very interesting trick here. I'll explain it to you in a moment, but here's Lantier and the Fetzer Institute one more time.
I knew that if we didn't add the spiritual dimension to this work, we were going to leave kids with not all they needed to know. And the Fetzer Institute is really poised right now to step up in supporting this movement.
Fetzer understands that a basic science to establish the natural spirituality of the child presented a blueprint for building a new system of education. The people of Fetzer walk the walk.
Wow. Okay. So the way SEL works, they've developed new competencies, right? Competencies used to be the child can read, right? The child can do his multiplication tables. That used to be the competencies that we talked about. Now we talk about new competencies like empathy and compassion. And I think everybody sitting here wants their children to be empathetic and compassionate. The only problem is they have a very different definition of empathy and compassion than you do. In their vocabulary, to have empathy means supporting abortion on demand. It means supporting wide open borders. It means supporting the LGBT agenda in all respects, including the castration of little boys and double mastectomies and hysterectomies for little girls. If you don't agree with those things, you're not compassionate and you need an intervention. And so they get your data and they say, this child isn't displaying appropriate levels of compassion. We need to circle back and do an intervention. And if you still won't comply, you probably have a mental problem. We're going to have to start putting you on drugs, very serious drugs. So that's what they do. And now the UN is injecting this into schools all over the world. They have a whole agency dedicated just to this. It's called UNESCO MGIP. It stands for the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. It's a mouthful. And they're very proud of what they're doing. You can go to their website and read all of this yourself. They're transforming education. Okay, now here's the three amigos who set this thing up. We'll look at each one individually. This is Irina Bokova. She hates me with a passion, and I wear that as a badge of honor. She was the head of UNESCO when this monstrosity was set up. She was also a member of the Bulgarian Communist Party, and not just like a lowly member. She was such a high-ranking member that they made her the foreign minister of the mass-murdering communist dictatorship that slaughtered 250,000 people out of a population of 10 million. So she's got some very serious credentials to set up institutions like this. This lady right here, Rosa Utunbayeva, she was the head of the Soviet Kyrgyz Republic, also a mass murderer, and she was the head of the Soviet Commission on UNESCO. So two communists, and then the obligatory New Age wackadoodle weirdo. This guy right here, his name is Dr. Karan Singh, and he's the co-chair of the World Commission on Global Consciousness and Spirituality. The other co-chair was Robert Mueller, who we'll meet in a moment. But another fun fact about this guy, in addition to his New Age occult pagan connections, is he was the Minister of Family Planning in India during the most extensive campaign of forcible sterilization in all of human history. Almost single-handedly, this guy sterilized tens of millions of people, mostly poor people, by force. Okay. Now, here they are bragging about what they're doing with SEL to your children. This is a webinar by UNESCO MGIP talking about the main goal of what they're doing.
Everyone, I come from UNESCO MGIP that is based in New Delhi, and we'll be talking to you today about socio-emotional learning and how we feel that this is the key to building global citizenship. My name is Nandini Chatterjee Singh, and I'm a neuroscientist by training.
Social emotional learning is the key to building global citizenship. Okay, that's what they say. Now, we as Christians, we know our citizenship is in heaven. Praise the Lord, we were blessed to be born, most of us, in this country. We're citizens of the United States of America. And you know what? I grew up all over the world. I lived in 8 countries on 4 continents. I'm only recently back in the United States. And so I like people from all over the world, but I would rather keep my American citizenship than be some citizen of the world. But they're very serious about this. Here's one of the key UN people working on this. I can't pronounce his name, so I won't even try. But here he is giving a talk explaining how they're going to use SEL to completely transform the next generation.
No
about if I told you that within a generation, we could have a society that was more just, was more fair, and had better chances of peace? What if I told you that within 15 years, we could have an entire new generation of young people? They would think better than you or me. They would think equal. Now, what if I told you that we are creating this generation right now? So, how are we doing it? Simple. It's called education. Not just any type of education, but social and emotional intelligence. If we are going to see a systematic generational change in how things are done in this world, then we have to change mindsets. And we can only change mindsets through education. Where do we start? Well, the answer actually lies in neuroscience. So neuroscience tells us that about 75% of a child's brain development takes place between the ages of 3 to 7. Now, this is a period of the optimal cognitive modifiability of a child. What does that mean? That means that it is during this period that a child's personality, worldviews, and value system is being formed. So neuroscience actually tells us that if we want to have a more enlightened human being, that this is where we should start. Therefore, this is where we did.
And he goes on. It's really creepy. You've heard this push about we got to have pre-kindergarten, right? We need your kids like from the moment we can pry them loose from their moms. That's why. They want to manipulate their mindsets, their beliefs, their worldview, and they say it openly at this point. It's not Alex Newman telling you this. All you got to do is read their documents, listen to their speeches. Now, they also have something called the World Core Curriculum. The guy who wrote it, Robert Mueller, I mentioned him earlier. He was the other co-chair of that World Commission on Spirituality and New Age Weirdness. He's called the father of global education. And he also viewed the United Nations, in his words, as the body of Christ, which we as Christians, of course, know that's blasphemous and ridiculous. But he did this World Core Curriculum, and he said it needs to be taught to every child in every school in every single country in the world. And that's what they're working toward now. And I got a copy of his materials. And in the teacher's manual, he's got a foreword to this World Core Curriculum. And he says something really interesting that's easy to just read right over. He says the underlying philosophy upon which it's based is going to be found in the teachings of the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Djwhal Khul. And I mentioned Alice Bailey earlier. She's most notorious for having founded the Lucifer Publishing Company. It's still around today. It's called the Lucius Trust because Lucifer Publishing was just a little bit too obvious. And that ascended master, this Tibetan teacher, Djwhal Khul, not a teacher, not even a human being, a spiritual entity that Alice Bailey claimed to be communicating with. And she did a book called Education in the New Age. I have a copy of it. This was, according to her, dictated to her by this demonic entity. She says, we're laying the foundation for the emergence of a new species of human being, a more highly evolved unit. She says through education, and self-consciousness must be unfolded until the man recognizes that his consciousness is a corporate part of a greater whole. You know, we think of collectivism like they want to collectivize our farms and our businesses. They think of collectivism as like we're even going to collectivize your mind. Okay? They're eventually his, and he becomes group conscious, she says. This needs to be the main objective of all true educational endeavor. Okay? She says world citizenship needs to be the goal of the enlightened with a world federation and a world brain. And we're going to get there by fusing Marxism and neo-scholasticism using the methods of John Dewey, the founding father of our public school system. Isn't that interesting? Now, this whole idea that world citizenship is the goal of education, I mentioned, is not a secret at all. Here's the then Secretary General of the UN, his name is Ban Ki-moon, openly telling you this.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
So it's not me telling you that the UN is trying to turn your children into global citizens. They're proud of it, they're bragging about it, they're using your money to do it, and they're manipulating your children in ways you can't even begin to fathom. So how does that relate to the United States then? Well, in 2004, Bill Gates of hell went over to UNESCO headquarters in Paris. You're probably familiar with Bill Gates, the computer guy. And he signed an agreement with the UNESCO. There he is, shaking hands with the president of UNESCO. And they agreed they were going to create a global set of standards, a global set of curricula, global teacher training programs, and the global technological systems to make it all work. And then Bill Gates came back to the United States, and you probably are familiar with this part of the story. He started pouring millions and then billions of dollars into this atrocity that we know today as Common Core. And by the way, I don't care what your politicians say. Common Core is in Missouri, and it's in Florida, and it's in every one of our states. And they bought ads to show you how great Common Core was going to be. This is an ad that was paid for by the government and Bill Gates, and I want to let you listen to what they say.
Graduating senior in, say, St. Louis is prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone. So
they said it. Common Core matches up with the international standards. And so now the kids in Seattle and Chicago and Shanghai and Paris and St. Louis and Cape Girardeau, they're all going to be learning the same nonsense. Isn't that interesting? They're bragging about what they're doing. So let's switch gears a little bit. Now, it's not just the brainwashing of our children. They're also working to totally transform our economy. And the World Economic Forum is actually leading this charge. In 2019, they put out a press release. This is from the UN. Here's the same press release from the World Economic Forum. And they said the World Economic Forum was going to be the strategic partner of the United Nations in bringing in these dramatic transformations. They were going to bring the business community to the table. And so the UN talks of a three-legged stool approach to bringing in these global changes. You have the first leg is the public sector, the governments. And so the UN represents the public sector, right? All the national governments of the world. Then you have the business sector. That's the second leg. That's where the World Economic Forum comes in. And then the third leg of the stool is what they describe as the religious sector and the social sector. So we'll look briefly at each of those. You might remember Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock. He's also on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations that we met earlier and the World Economic Forum. And here he's bragging about what they're up to.
Well, behaviors are going to have to change, and this is one thing we're asking companies. You have to force behaviors, and at BlackRock we are forcing behaviors.
You have to change behaviors. And people think this only applies to public companies that are publicly traded on the stock market, because basically what BlackRock is doing is they're taking our money, our 401ks, our pensions, any money we have invested in ETFs, and then they're forcing these companies to destroy their own businesses. You have to go woke, you have to do the DEI, you have to do the ESG, you have to worry about your climate and carbon footprint, you have to give Al Gore more money, you have to give this radical group more money. So that's where the World Economic Forum comes in. They've got the big businesses of the world all on this agenda. And if any of you work for big corporations, you're probably starting to see a lot of this. My dad spent many, many decades as an executive with Dow Chemical. And we would look at the stuff they were sending out. He's like, what? And he would write to the CEO, Liveris. He used to call him Sir Evil. Like, what are you doing? This is terrible for business. Why are you doing that? Oh, well, you know, we kind of have to, right? It's just necessary. You got to change with the times. So let's look for a moment at the religious angle as well. The third leg of the stool. They have an organization they call Religions for Peace. It's funded by the UN. It's funded by the State Department. It's funded by USAID, or at least it was until recently. It's funded by George Soros, funded by the Rockefellers, and all the rest. And they agreed in 2019 that they committed all of their religions, their denominations, their movements to human development as set forth in the 2030 Agenda. And they said it openly. Here's their final declaration. And here's the lady who leads it. Before taking this job as the head of the UN of Religions, she was actually in charge of population control for the UN at the UN Population Fund. Interesting. Right? God said, be fruitful and multiply, and so the population control nuts are everywhere. But here she is talking about her little group.
My name is Azza Karam, and I have the privilege and the responsibility of serving a worldwide movement of interreligious institutions, organizations called Religions for Peace. In case you do not know it, we think of it as the United Nations of Religions. The United Nations has member states or governments. Religions for Peace has member religious institutions, all religious institutions, representing all the religions, representing
all religious institutions, representing all religions. I was like, wait a minute, what? I called my pastor. Pastor, is that true? Are we members of the Religions for Peace? Like, no, what's that? So you know what the trick is? They don't like extremists. And you know who are extremists? The people who say Jesus is the way. You know, they want you to think it's like Al-Qaeda and Hamas. No, no, no. It's us. If you say Jesus is the way, you're the extremist. So all religions are welcome except the extremists. Okay. And so I could show you so much on this, but I went to the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt in 2022, it must have been, for the UN Climate Summit. And you might have heard, they unveiled a new and improved 10 Commandments. Okay. The UN actually put out an incredible document right before the thing started. It said the old systems of ethics and morality are no longer adequate for the present age because we're not taking good enough care of Mother Earth. So we need new ethics. They said we need people to act according to new moral codes. And then all these religious wackadoodles walked up to the top of Mount Sinai, and they did a weird ritual where they repented for their climate sins and their airplane travel and the steak that they ate. Oh, sorry, sorry, sorry. And then they whip out the new and improved 10 Commandments. And it is blasphemous to the core, right? It says compassion means feeling the cries of Mother Earth. It's right straight from the new 10 Commandments, okay? And I ran into one of the organizers of this abomination. His name was James Sternlich, CEO of the Peace Department at the UN. And I asked him if I could have an interview. And they're like, yeah. They didn't know who I was. So I'm going to show you a little excerpt from that.
All religions teach us to respect the creation that we have been given. And we've done kind of a terrible job of that. And so with a new kind of 10 Commandments of climate change, which are an addendum to, not a replacement for, the original 10 Commandments, and a third covenant that we're some kind of working on between mankind and creation, that we would refocus on those elements of the teachings from across religions that point us in the direction of fixing the problems that we've created so that life can thrive on this planet and so that we can build that proverbial kingdom of heaven here on earth.
So there you heard it.
Wow. So the UN and Friends is bringing us a new and improved 10 Commandments. God gave us the original. UN's got a new one. And God, of course, gave us the Old Covenant. And he gave us the New Covenant. And now the UN and Friends is working, as you heard him say, on the third covenant. Okay? Interesting. So what does this all mean for the United States of America? Like, what might we expect in the years ahead? Well, they really don't like America. I probably don't need to tell you that. Not because they have anything in particular against me or you, but because they hate the principles that our country was founded on. They are absolutely incompatible with this diabolical agenda they have for the world. You can't have a global slave state if people believe they have God-given rights, if people have AR-15s in their closet, if people teach their kids how to shoot. You just can't have that, right? You can't have private property rights and these kinds of things. So they've got to tackle the United States of America. Basically, I'm telling you, you are all that stands in between these megalomaniacs and a global totalitarian regime where the economy, the political process, and even the religious side of it are all under the control of these monsters. So one of the strategies that they are pursuing is to hit us with crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis, ultimately all culminating in what the World Economic Forum, or the World Economic Forum, calls the polycrisis. And the polycrisis, I believe, is just around the corner. I think we got a sneak preview during COVID. And frankly, it's not a new agenda. You might remember Rahm Emanuel, Chief of Staff to Barack Obama.
We don't want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
Yes, an opportunity to do things you didn't think you could do before. And this is not new. Tyrants figured this out a long time ago. 200 years ago, the great French lawmaker, and I think my friend Dan has some copies of his book in the back, The Law, which is an incredible book if you haven't read it. He observed that these tyrants are always concocting the antidote and the poison in the same laboratory. In other words, they're creating the crisis and then offering us a fake solution to the crisis that they created. And they do this all the time. Right? I mean, like literally, we're living through it every single day. They create a crisis, they fund a Wuhan gain-of-function research, create a COVID, whoops, now we have to take all your freedom away. It's like a daily basis now we're seeing this kind of madness. And they actually understood this. Back in 1962, the U.S. State Department wanted to figure out how do we get to a one-world government. So they commissioned a guy, his name was Lincoln Bloomfield, to write a report. And the report was called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. They kind of gave away the end game in the title. And what he said was that if we want to have this world system, the fastest way to get to it is to use a grave crisis or war to bring about a sudden transformation in national attitudes sufficient for the purpose. He went on to say that we need a crisis, a war, or brink of war situation so grave or commonly menacing that deeply rooted attitudes and practices are sufficiently shaken to open up the possibility of a revolution in world political arrangements. And it works. Okay, World War I gave birth to the League of Nations. The only reason that didn't take off was because our Senate had the sense to say, no, we're not participating. World War II, almost every globalist institution you can think of was born in the aftermath of World War II. The United Abominations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Coal and Steel Community that eventually morphed into the European Union. We'll see the role of these regional governments before we wrap today. And interestingly, speaking of creating crises, I mentioned Anthony Sutton earlier. I truly believe he is one of America's greatest historians of all time. He did an incredible book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. What he showed was that some of the most powerful financiers and industrialists in the United States of America gave rise to the Nazi movement in Germany. And I'm talking the Rockefellers, I'm talking the Bush family. Senator Prescott Bush was actually arrested under the Trading with the Enemy Act for his role at Union Bank, which was financing the Nazis. Ford, all these guys. Okay? They also, by the way, financed the Bolshevik Revolution, but a subject for another day. And so now we see they're agitating for a third world war on all sides of this equation. Putin, Zelensky. Seems like Donald Trump's the only one who's saying, guys, do we really have to kill everybody? Right? Can we just not chill with this? And they say no, right? Trump said, Putin, stop bombing stuff in Ukraine, please. What did Putin do? Launched a bunch of missiles. And then when the first responders showed up, he launched a bunch more. Why? Right? Same thing with Zelensky. Hey, why don't you sign this peace agreement? No, I don't want that peace agreement. Right? He got spanked in the White House. Why are they so obsessed with war? Because they know it's the most effective tool for bringing about globalism. Here's the president of the new European Soviet, the European Union, talking about how we're rearming, getting ready for war with the Russians. What a stupid idea. And they've been doing this forever, right? They did it in Syria. Do you remember Donald Trump talking about ISIS?
I call President Obama and Hillary Clinton the founders of ISIS. They're the founders. In fact, I think we'll give Hillary Clinton the, if you're on a sports team, most valuable player.
And the media freaked out. He can't say that. What a crazy conspiracy theorist. And then the document came out from the Defense Intelligence Agency proving, and these are direct quotes from the document, by the way, the West, in other words, the Obama administration, the UK, the French, the Gulf countries, the Sunni Islamic dictatorships on the Arabian Peninsula, and Turkey support the Syrian opposition. We knew that, the moderate rebels, right? Well, the government knew they weren't moderate rebels. In that very same memo, they said, the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda are the major forces driving the insurgency. See, they want you to think they're stupid. Oh, we didn't know we were funding and arming head-chopping lunatics. Right now, they're slaughtering Christians as fast as they can find them in the most barbaric ways imaginable. That was brought courtesy of the U.S. government. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Here's another quote from that same document that Trump used to silence all these liars. He said, the document said, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria, and this is exactly what the powers supporting the opposition want. And of course, they got it, right? The Salafist principality, you see it right there, we call it the Islamic State. These are the maniacs who are running Syria today, courtesy of your tax dollars. And then, in addition to murdering all the Christians of Syria, they got another benefit. They were able to drive millions of jihadists into Europe. They were able to fly them right here into your backyard so they could make a mess here. Now, the United Nations is very strategic about this. I pulled this right off of their website. It's from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. They said, international migrants are important agents of change. I don't know if you can see their headline there. And here's what they said. International migrants are important agents of change, and international migration can facilitate the achievement of many goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And here we suckers thought it was about humanitarianism or that we didn't have enough babies so we needed somebody to pay Social Security. Baloney. It's about this. It's about destroying our countries. And actually, the UN Migration Czar has been very open about this. He did an interview with the UN. He said, we have to realize now, sovereignty is an absolute illusion that has to be put behind us. Okay? He said we have to take on some of those old historic memories and images of our own country and recognize we're now part of humankind. And he says this openly in interviews, right?
We have a demographic problem. The day of hiding behind borders and fences is long gone.
No more hiding behind borders, okay? We're not going to do the border thing anymore. We're done with that. And so I just got back from Europe. Again, my wife is from Sweden, and it's terrible what has happened there. I've lived in 4 different European countries, and this is happening all across Western Europe. In the capital of Britain, British people are now literally a minority in their own capital. They have a Muslim mayor, and most